Hello, heathens, witches, Vikings, and pagans. Thanks again for joining me. I am your host, Jonai Ingolf, aka Rad Viking Dad. So as the title suggests, today we will be speaking about the Hàvamàl. We will be speaking about it, but we will not be going through it, at least not in its entirety. The reason for this is the Hàvamàl itself is far too long to go through in one video. I will be doing a collection of videos later on down the road, breaking down the different stanzas and the different verses within the Hàvamàl, anywhere between 5 to 10 at a time, depending on timing and, the length of the videos and things of that nature. But for now, we will be speaking about the Hàvamàl, its origins, and its place in modern society, and how we are to basically learn from it as modern-day Vikings. Now, the copy that I have is The Wanderer's Hàvamàl by Dr. Jackson Crawford. He has a YouTube channel as well. I highly suggest you check him out. I'm going to put a link down below. I digress. What is the Hàvamàl? Where did it come from? How old is it? The Hàvamàl is actually a part of a greater text referred to as the Codex Regius, or simply the Edda. There are two versions of the Eddas that we commonly read, that is the poetic and the prose. The difference between those is literally just wording. They both say essentially the same thing, they just say it in different ways. The poetic Edda is meant to rhyme, it's said in a specific type of candor, and can be a little difficult to read sometimes because the verbiage is frankly dated. However, the prose Edda is written more along the lines for modern understanding, modern interpretation. Think of it in terms that most of us would probably understand, especially if we come from Christian backgrounds and we are new to the faith. The poetic Edda versus the prose Edda is very much like King James versus NIV. Say the same thing, just in different ways. Now, within the Eddas, there's a collection of poems and proverbs, essentially, for everyday living, as well as retellings of events that have happened in Odin's life, different things that he has experienced himself. That is why it is so important to a modern-day Viking, especially to me, personally, because my patron is Odin. So, I try to listen to his words when I can. As heathens, Vikings, do we believe that Odin himself came down from Asgard, wrote these words down, bestowed it upon his people? No. No. Do we believe that they are influenced by Odin? Oh, absolutely. But at the end of the day, these stories were still spoken by men and eventually recorded by man. How old is it? Prose Edda, or the Edda itself, rather, dates back to 1270 AD, when Snorri Sturluson gathered together the elders in his community and wrote the stories that they would tell him about the gods, different epic tales of epic heroes, and just a collection of his history, of his culture. For Snorri Sturluson was Icelandic, but he was also a Catholic monk in an Icelandic Catholic monastery. But as a monk, he was one of the few with the ability to read and write. And he did not want to see his culture completely dissolve away. He wanted there to be some record of his people, of the tales of his people, his heritage. So even though he was Catholic and a monk, and may or may not have believed in the gods necessarily, for the purposes of history and heritage, he documented these stories, these tales. And for that, we modern Vikings are forever in his debt. But any version of the Eddas, poetic, prose, whatever, any version that you find are going to be translations from Old Icelandic to now. The copy of the Hàvamàl that I have is a translation by Dr. Jackson Crawford, who is, in my humble opinion, the modern definitive source for anything pertaining to ancient Nordic studies. That's enough of a plug for Dr. Jackson. I digress. The Edda was recorded in 1270 AD, but the stories, the verbal telling, the oral tradition of passing down these stories generation to generation, given the verbiage and the linguistic evidence before us, most likely told between the 8th and 9th century which still leaves several hundred years of stories to dissolve and dissipate, alter and change, as unfortunately has had a tendency to happen with oral tradition. There may be many different variations of stories that we have in the Eddas that we will just simply never know, or tales that haven't been told in centuries because no one's been left alive to tell them who remembers them. The Codex Regius, the Eddas, the Hàvamàl, they are the most complete version that we have availability to. But are they complete in their entirety? Who can say? Certainly not this Viking. But pertaining to the Hàvamàl, what does it mean? The word Hàvamàl can be translated one of two ways. Words of the High One or words of the One-Eyed. Both refer to Odin. These are texts and passages supposedly given to us by Odin. What are we to do with them? In today's modern age, this was a text written in the 13th century. How are we supposed to interpret them? How are we supposed to use them here in the 21st? Just as society changes, just as people evolve, I believe the gods evolve as well. So do we take them at their literal translation and run with them thinking that the gods themselves never change? No, absolutely not. Odin, among other things, was the god of wisdom, god of knowledge. And he, better than any of us, know that as times change, what we know to be fact changes as well. So too should his words. They should evolve, they should adapt, they should not necessarily change, but definitely adapt to modern living. For today's video, I have marked 3 passages, 2 of them tied directly into each other, one right after the other. They pretty much talk on the same thing. And one of them seems outdated, antiquated, and frankly a bit chauvinistic. But I want to use these as examples of how we can interpret them in today's society. How we can take these ancient words, these ancient texts, and adapt them to modern life. So let's jump right in. The first ones, stanzas 58 and 59. Honestly, some of my personal favorite. And, if I'm also honest, ones that I need to work on adhering to a little bit more. As should we all. 58. Rise early if you want to take another man's property or his life. A sleeping wolf seldom gets his meat, or a sleeping warrior a victory. 59. Rise early if you have no one to work for you, and get straight to work. You lose more than time if you sleep when it dawns. For the earlier riser, wealth is half won. That is a prime example of something we should always strive to adhere to. Rising early, being the first to the feast, as it were. If we were to take that literal, it would basically mean if we have murder in our heart or theft on our mind, we should get up before the dawn so we can kill the man while he still sleeps, while he's still groggy, and then take his property. That's how they did it back then. But again, that was a different time. How does it equate to modern society when we have evolved past such barbarosity? Rather than taking it to mean someone's life or their property, think of it in these terms. If you're seeking to get a job, be the first one in line for the job interview. If you work the stock markets, be the first one at the market. If you live on the West Coast and you sleep until 9 o'clock, which is a reasonable time by anyone's standards, you got to remember it's 11 o'clock East Coast. Stock markets have been open for 2 hours. You've already missed out on quite a bit. In everything you do, be mindful of its timing. Don't dawdle. Don't wait for it. Don't just sit back and wait for something to happen. Go forth and make it your own. Make it happen. I said it in my last video, there is no such thing as a lazy Viking. And I will be honest, it is something that I need to work on adhering to myself. There are so many days when it's just so much easier to just roll over and say 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes. That bed is so comforting. That sleep, so refreshing. But there are passages in the Hàvamàl that I will get to in later videos where it speaks about going to bed early. There's no shame in it. None whatsoever. Adjust your sleeping pattern. If you have important tasks to handle the next day, be sure to get plenty of rest. Go to bed early if you must, but don't let the day get away from you. The second part of that, if you don't have anybody to work for you, if you're a self-made man or woman and you own a business, If you don't have any employees yet, don't waste any time. Go out there, beat the pavement, work hard, do what you gotta do. Build yourself up. Eventually you will have people to work for you. But until such time, work the way you want your employees to work for you. Don't dawdle, don't waste time. That second text, 59, could probably be translated to time is money. The more you waste, the more you lose. Now, the third and final text that I'll be going over in this video, I've earmarked as a prime example of one of those passages that needs adjustment, a little fine-tuning to fit in today's society. Now keep in mind, the Vikings, the heathens of old, the ancient Norse, were very progressive as far as it pertained to gender equality. They had shield maidens who were just as fierce and just as deadly in battle. Women could own property. There were laws that protected women from rape. There were laws that protected women from divorce and unfair proceedings and the like. They were one of the few ancient societies that actually had rights for their women. I will do a video kind of breaking down those intricacies later on down the road, but for now, it's merely important to know that they were very progressive in that respect. Be that as it may, you still got to remember the time frame in which this was written. It was a very chauvinistic time period, very male-dominated, even in Norse culture. And also remember the influence of who was writing this. This, even though it is a record of oral traditions from ancient Norse and Icelandic elders, at the end of the day, this was still written by a Catholic monk, of which I think it's fair to say that, at least in ancient society, Christianity was a very male-dominated religion. Honestly, still is today. One of the reasons why I don't care for it. It's just me personally. That having been said, this passage is evidence of that, and why we should not take these texts as direct word of mouth from Odin himself. Because at the end of the day, it was still influenced, altered, told, and written by man. Stanza 84. No man should trust the words of a girl, nor anything a woman says. Women's hearts are molded on a wobbly wheel. Faithlessness is planted at their core. Sounds like somebody jaded to me. But I digress. How can we possibly adjust this to today's modern standards? Just a little rewrite. Keep in mind, these are sacred texts to us, but we don't revere them as holy and immovable and unchanging. No. Quite the opposite. We realize that times back then were different, and that sometimes laws and requirements must change. As times change, so do the gods. Otherwise, they lose their relevancy. So how do we adjust a particular text to today's standards? It's actually easier than you think. And the key is the wording of it initially. No man should trust the words of a girl. Now let's think about that for a minute. When you think girl, you're thinking young girl, someone immature, someone young, someone foolhardy, hot-headed. So why not replace that with youth or children? Let's see how that changes when we do that. No man should trust the words of a child, nor anything a child says. Children's hearts are molded on a wobbly wheel. Faithlessness is planted at their core. Now that's not to say that children are evil, merely immature, underdeveloped, hot-headed, quick to speak falsities to serve their own gains. How many times have we noticed our children, our own children, telling us one thing when you probably knew that wasn't the case? We can adjust this to basically say, don't take the word of a child at face value. For as they grow, as they mature, they will gain the knowledge to speak wiser. But until then, remember the source. Just children. That is an example of how we can take certain antiquated and outdated texts and alter it to still have meaning in today's society, and how we can still learn and grow from such an ancient text. Keep in mind, Odin was the god of wisdom. He wanted us to think for ourselves. He doesn't want sheep. If he wanted sheep, he would have two sheep named Geri and Freki by his side in Asgard. No, instead, he has the wolves, Geri and Freki, by his side. Who do you think he would honor more? A wolf who thinks for themselves, comes to their own conclusions, or a sheep who just follows a shepherd? And with that, I'll end the video. If you like what you've seen, please consider liking and subscribing. And as always, Skål!